Hey good folks, I'm here for CG Tuts, and welcome to part 8 of the tattoo gun tutorial. I've already saved this file under a new title, so this is the tattoo gun tutorial part 8 in your project files. To save me some time, from this point on I'm using my original tattoo gun model, and if we'll check out the unwrapping, you can see we've got slightly different array. You can probably recognize the Wingnut fastener, the coil, and this is the strip of the frame. This is a strip for the rear spring. These are the cords with the O-ring. And last we've got the needle, which doesn't have any unwrapping since it's extremely small and basically has no texture. I would like to create 4 shaders. One shader for the needle, a second shader for the rubbers, a third shader for the cords, and a fourth shader for the rest of the parts, which is obviously going to be the most complex shader. So let's jump right in and start with the fourth shader. We'll select all the meta parts, right click, assign new material, and I'll choose the anisotropic material. Now I rather use the anisotropic material rather than the blin or the fong or fong E, and that's because of the specular highlight we see over here, which as opposed for the blin for instance or the fong, the anisotropic specular highlight resembles real-life metal a lot closer than the other shaders. So we'll leave the anisotropic material attributes at their default state for the moment, and we'll select one of the objects that holds this material. We'll go to texturing, create PSD network. The image size will be 2048 by 2048, and I'll change its name to tutorial metal texture. As for the attributes, we will use the color, the bump, and the specular color. In the original model I haven't used diffuse pass, but I do believe it will be a good addition, so we'll add diffuse as well, and we'll click on this right arrow to pass these attributes to the selected attributes. We'll make sure that the Open Adobe Photoshop is turned on, and we'll hit apply. And that automatically opens up Photoshop with our newly created file. Let's close this up. Inside here we've got the UV snapshot and the 4 passes: the specular, color, diffuse, bump, and color. Now obviously we don't have all the UVs here, so what we'll need to do is go back to Maya, and we don't need this anymore. We can close this window as well as this one. Now I'll select again all the parts, at least all the metal parts, and I'll open up the UV texture editor. This will be a good opportunity to see how I distributed all the UVs here, and let me just deselect the needle, which is the big part you see in the middle. Over here this part is the frame sides, this is the frame strip, this is the rear spring strip and the sides, a coil, the armature bar, the wingnut fastener, and so on and so forth. We'll right click and go to polygons. We can't see it through the recording, but the last option in this menu is the UV snapshot. We can also reach to it through this menu. The last option is UV snapshot. We'll click on it once. We'll set the size to 2048 and we'll rename it to tutorial metal out UVs. We'll hit OK. Let's go back to Photoshop and we'll open the image we just created. Drag this image outside and we'll drag it in our texture file. Okay, we can close it now and just place it in the middle. We'll copy this name and let's paste it here. You can delete this one. And obviously we need to get rid of all the black here, so we'll just set the transfer mode to screen. Any layer that is outside of these folders won't appear in the corresponding attributes of the shader, and vice versa, everything inside these folders would appear in the corresponding attributes of the shader. We'll start with the color, so we'll turn off the eyes for the specular color, the diffuse, and the bump. Rename this one to base, and we'll paint it black. We'll hit G to get the bucket tool and just paint it black. Now inside here I would like to create a new folder, and I'll call this metal base, and inside it I'll drag a metal texture I've downloaded from CG Textures. I would like to scale it down, and I'll duplicate it by hitting Alt and dragging it. Let's get rid of this one for a second. And to get rid of the seam here, I'll drag it till it snaps to the right side. Let's see where it ends. So let's say up to here. Let's give it a bit more. Up to here. Okay. And I'll choose the mask tool and set the feather to, let's say, 25 or so. And I'll select most of this part. I don't want the selection to end here, so I'll go to Select, Transform Selection, and I'll scale up the selection on both ends, and now I'll hit Del. And I've got a feathered transition here, which you literally can't see. I'll merge these together, Ctrl E, and we'll call this one Metal. I'll duplicate this layer by alt-clicking and dragging up this layer. And now I've got a copy of it, and I'll shut down the eye for it. I'll keep this one as a reference. Now, as for this one, I would like to color correct it a bit. We'll hit Ctrl L to add levels to it, and I'll tighten a bit the black input and the white input, just to make it a bit more intense. And I'll hit Ctrl M to get the curves menu, and I like to give it a bit more of a blue hue, so I'll lower the red a bit, maybe increase the green just a little bit, and increase the blue, take out some of that red, and I would also like to desaturate it a bit, so I'll hit Ctrl U to get the hue and saturation menu and knock out some of that saturation. Okay, this is more like it. Now, we'll rename this one to Metal CC, which stands for color corrected. I would also like to give it a bit more contrast, so let's bring back the curves, Ctrl M. In the RGB channel, we'll give it a bit of a S shape to give it a bit more contrast. We'll hit OK, and we'll again bring back the hue and saturation menu and desaturate it again. Now I'll duplicate this layer again and hide the original one, and I'll start dividing it to the different parts. We'll start off with the rear spring. This is the strip, this is the sides, and this is the hole. I'll deselect the hole, so Alt select to deselect. We'll hit Ctrl Shift I to inverse the selection and hit Del to get rid of the unnecessary parts. This part will be the rear spring. So this is the rear spring. We'll duplicate the metal CC again, place it on top of the rear spring and unhide it. I'll select the front spring, excluding its sides. I only want the front and back. And again, Ctrl Shift I to invert the selection and delete the rest of the parts. Ctrl D to get rid of the selection. And this is the front spring. Now I would need to repeat the process for the frame, strip and sides, excluding the holes, which are these parts here. the coil, which is this large piece here in the middle, and the grip, which is this part here. Now, if you find it hard to find your way around this UV maze here, you can always switch to Maya, select the different parts, and you can immediately understand which part belongs where. So I'll pause the recording and quickly add the metal base to those parts, and we'll continue on from there. As you can see, I've added the rest of the parts, the frame, the grip, and the coil. And next I would like to start focusing on each part individually. So I'll create a new folder and I'll rename it Frame. We'll first start with the frame strip. Now to the frame strip I would like to add that treble pattern we've seen in the original model. Over here I've got a nice tribal pattern I've downloaded from the web. You can find those things for free download in a minute, literally. So I'll drag it to my texture file and I can close this one. You can see there's a color overlay effect here that is turned off, and if I'll turn it on you can see it's very light gray. Scale it down, set it straight in the middle. We can scale it down a bit more, and I'll rename this one to Tribal. I'll duplicate it by alt-clicking and dragging up to this point approximately where they solo connect, and I will need to repeat that process. Now remember, this here is the front part, and up here is the inner part, which we don't really see. I'm not sure if I want the pattern appearing here. For now, let's bring back the metal base and keep on duplicating the tribal. I'm happy with this, and I would like to merge all of those together. But before I do that, I'd rather create another folder, and I'll rename this one to Tribals, and I'll put all of these in the folder. Duplicate those, Alt drag to duplicate, and hit Ctrl E to merge those. And now we can hide these. Now I would like to give these more of a blue hue. So let's duplicate this one and hide the original one. Ctrl U to bring up the hue consideration, colorize it, and give it a slight blue hue. Something of this sort should be fine. It's getting closer to the background here, and I'll hit OK. Now let's go back to the metal base folder, and I'll choose the frame layer and duplicate it to the frame folder by alt-clicking and dragging to the frame folder, and I'll place it on top of the tribals so it's hiding the tribals. And next I would like to paint it black, so let's hit Ctrl U and we'll set the lightness to -100. OK. Now I would like to start revealing the frames underneath by slowly erasing and decaying the black layer. Let's rename this one to Black Overlay, and we'll duplicate it and hide the original. If we won't be happy with the result, we can always go back. Start with the eraser tool. The brush I would like to start with is one of these fan brushes. OK, and I'll set the size to be larger, something of this sort. And already the opacity is at a very low state, as well as the flow. And the result that I would get is this scratching sort of effect, which works very, very nicely. And I'll continue on with it. From this point on, I think I would lower the opacity even more, let's say to 15, and flow to 10. Make sure you're only erasing from the middle and not from the sides. If you do get to the sides, it's not too terrible, but most of the decaying should be in the middle. And at this point I think I would choose a soft brush. We'll set the size to something of this sort, around 80. Start revealing even more of the center. Okay, I like the result I'm getting here, but I think I would like to add a bit more of a contrast in the edges. I'll duplicate this layer again, Alt, click and drag, hide the original. I'll select the paintbrush tool. I'm using black at the moment, and I'll bring back the black to the edges, but in a very, very subtle way. We'll set the opacity to, let's say, 20, and flow even lower, let's say 10. So if I'll edit, it's a very subtle thing. It's actually too subtle. Let's set to 30 and flow to 20. Okay, something like this should be fine. And let's see, I'll start adding just to the edges. If your hand slips, it's okay. Those mistakes would probably look great on this sort of texture. Next, I would also like to blur a bit the sides. So again, I'll duplicate this layer and hide the original. And I'll choose the blur tool. And at this point, I'll duplicate the tribal. We can hide this one for now. And I'll merge these two. The strength is set to 100, which is really high for me. Let's set it to 50, just to see how it goes. And this is more like it. Now, next I would need to repeat the process we've just created for the frame sides without the tribal. We'll first start by selecting the eraser, and we used this brush. Let's increase the opacity here, make it 25, and we'll set the float to 15, duplicate and hide the original. We'll lower the brush size, let's say 5. And I'm getting a bit more free here, allowing myself a bit more slipping to the sides, which is okay since I'm going to darken the sides. I'll duplicate this layer, hide the original, and now let's darken the sides here. We need a smaller brush. Okay, and I would like to blur out the edges here. One more part we've got to complete here, and that's the holes. These are the inner parts of the holes, and although most of them are concealed, we can see a small edge of them poking out, and I would like to paint that edge light blue. So I'll create a new layer for that. We call that holes. And I'll select the area I would like to paint. This is approximately the area. Let's see, I would like to paint it a light blue, almost turquoise, and maybe a bit lighter than this one. Something of this sort looks very nice, and I think it will blend very nicely with the background. G to get the paint bucket and fill this. I really should have done a better job here, but better late than never. And I'll get rid of the unnecessary area. And well, that's it for the frame. I'll save this file and switch back to Maya to see how it looks. Let's go to texturing and update PSD networks. And the frame looks very, very nice. I might add even a bit more of a black to the edges, but that entirely depends on you. For now, I think I would leave those as is. Go back to Photoshop, and at this point we can close the frame. The respring, the coil, and the grip needs to get the very same treatment, not including the tribal for the grip. As you can see, I've already went ahead and applied the same process to the rear spring, to the grip, and to the coils. In the case of the coils, I've also added another copy of the drivers and set the transfer mode to color dodge, which added this darker blue around the edges sort of look. To the coils, there's another color that I would like to add, a silver sort of color to the edges, i.e. this strip and this strip, this inner circle and this circle. We'll add another layer and we'll call this one simply silver. I'll mark this area. We'll choose a very light gray. Obviously it's not silver. What will make it silver is the combination of the color, diffuse, and the specular highlight. Mark this area as well. OK, and we'll hit G. And obviously we need to get rid of some of this selection. Hopefully that's it. You will have to make sure we didn't have any leak here. And if we did, we'll take care of that later. Let's see, we got this end here. And we've got this inner circle. So let's draw a quick mask here. Ctrl-Alt-Shift and left mouse dragging will produce a perfect circle from the middle of your selection. Go to Select, Transform Selection to do the fine tuning, and I'll hit G. I accidentally copied the silver layer, so we'll just merge these. Ctrl-E to merge. Rename that to silver parts. That's it for the coils for now. The next part I would like to deal with is the front spring. So let's go back to the metal base folder, duplicate the front spring. Again, I'm reminding you I'm doing that by Alt dragging the layer. Let's create a new folder for this one. Rename the folder front spring and we'll put this one in there. And we'll hit Ctrl U. Again, set the lightness to -100, making it virtually black. I've got here yet another tribal, a more simple tribal, which fits very nicely to this shape. We'll just scale it down. Okay, and as you can see, it's already got a color overlay applied to it. Again, from the same family of light blue turquoise sort of color, only this time I've used a darker tone. And this time around, what I would like to do is something a bit different. First, let's duplicate the front spring and hide the original. I would like to use the same tools that I've used so far, only this time I would like to reveal just the edges beneath the tribal. So again, I'll choose the eraser and I need this sort of brush on a very small scale with the opacity of 25, flow of 20, I think should be fine. And we might need to use even a smaller brush, let's say 10. And I only want to reveal the edges beneath the tribal. As we get closer to the finer edges, we need to use a smaller brush, let's say 5 pixels. Next, I'll take these two layers and duplicate those, and I'll merge those, Ctrl-E. We'll get rid of the bottom layers. And now that these two are combined, I'll select the dodge tool. Make sure you're using the dodge tool, not the burn tool or sponge. I would like to set the range instead of midtones to shadows. So I'll highlight whatever I'm marking, and I'll choose a smaller brush size, and I'll repeat only the edges here. And as you can see, that gave us somewhat of a blotchy look. Next, I would like to duplicate the tribal shape. and place it above this color layer. Let's reveal it, and we can get rid of its color overlay, so we are just left with the black, and set its transfer mode to soft light. And we'll go to filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and we'll use a radius of 2. And we might even duplicate these two and merge those, Ctrl E to merge. And we can now blur the edges just slightly, something of this sort, so the edges aren't as strong as they are at the moment. Okay, very sweet. Next we've got the sides of the front spring to take care of. We got two stripes here. This one probably belongs to the front spring, and this one probably belongs to the rear divider, i.e. this part. The rear divider won't have any texture, so I'll just paint them both in the light blue color. Let's add another layer here, and we'll call this one sides, and let's mark the area we need to paint. Okay, and select transform selection, and just making sure I only selected what I need, and I did up to this point. So Alt select to deselect this area, hit G to get the pocket tool, and there we go. And we can actually call this one front spring plus rear divider. Next we've got a few more metal parts, which we haven't prepared the metal base for. The reason I kept those for later is that I'm going to use a gold metal or a gold-like metal texture and a bronze or bronze-like metal texture, and those parts would be the rear binding post, the contact screw, and the capacitor connector. So without further ado, let's go back to our metal base, duplicate our metal CC, drag it on top of all the other layers, and reveal it. It will start with the rear binding post. This should do the trick, and let's start selecting our rear binding post. This entire section is our rear binding post. We can get rid of the leftovers, Ctrl Shift I to inverse the selection and delete what we don't need. Let's hit Ctrl U to get the hue and saturation menu. Let's colorize it and search for that golden color. We need a more saturated type of color. Okay, this is nice. And we'll rename this one to rear binding post. Next we've got the capacitor connector. So let's duplicate this layer. We'll drag it up here, get rid of the unnecessary parts, Ctrl Shift I to invert and delete the unnecessary parts. Let's hit Ctrl U again. Let's colorize it, and this time we'll use sort of a bronze, saturate it a bit more. Let's rename this one to capacitor connector. Let's again duplicate this shape here, since we've gotten enough flesh, so to speak, to use here. Now this is the contact screw, this is the top part, and this is the body. Let's trim these parts. We'll first trim the top part. Ctrl Shift J to cut out the selection. Mark this section as well, along with this little part here. And we'll hit Ctrl Shift I and delete. So, let's see. This one is the contact screw body, and this one is the contact screw top. Okay, we'll create a new folder for those, rename that to contact screw, and we'll put these two inside there. contact screw top can stay golden, and we need to recolorize the body. So let's hit Ctrl U and again colorize it. We'll choose another bronze saturated color. Next, we've got a few more segments here which we need to paint blue. We'll first do the rear spring screw, meaning this screw right here. We need to paint this inner radius blue. This is the rear spring screw, and this is the inner radius, this little strip here. So let's create a new layer for it. Rename it rear spring screw. Let's mark the section we want to paint. Okay. We just refine this selection. Hit G and paint this area. We have got the yoke sides. This strip here is the yoke and these are the sides. So let's create another layer for it. Rename it to yoke. We'll mark the section. Again, just a quick selection here. And select, do some selection to refine the selection. Okay, we'll hit G. It seems a bit dark, and the reason for that is that the rear spring covering some of it, so we'll just place this layer on top of everyone else. And there we go. It seems I forgot to paint blue one of the holes here for the frame, so we'll go back and do that right now. Open the frame and mark holes. Select the area and hit G. Then we can close that up. Next, we've got the Wingnut fastener, which also has parts that we need to color blue. And these parts would be this strip here and the inner strip for the wings, this strip here. I'll start by creating a new layer, rename it to Wingnut fastener. I'll select the area I want to colorize. Since these are basically polygons, I'm feeling okay doing this with the polygonal lasso tool and not the freehand one. Gives me a chance to be accurate and fast here. Okay, so I've got all the areas selected. I'll hit G and paint it blue. And that's it for the Wingnut fastener. Next, we've got the capacitor body and the tube. Let's do the tube real quick. Create a new layer and we'll rename that to tube. And we'll use the light gray for that. And let's mark the area we need. Select transform selection to refine that selection. And we'll hit G, fill that, and that's done. Now the capacitor body. Earlier I painted this section as a part of the coil, and it's really a part of the capacitor body. Now it needs to be gray, and we can leave that as is or cut this section and bring that into the capacitor body. For now I'm just going to leave it as is since it's colored correctly. It's just not named correctly. So let's create a new folder. And we've got a bit of a mess here. Let's open up the metal base, the rear spring screw, the contact screw, capacitor connector, and rear binding post. All should be outside the metal parts folder. Okay, now rename our new folder capacitor, place capacitor connector inside that folder, and we'll create a new layer called capacitor body. We got this end, which I would like to paint gray, but not the whole section. Set this section to this size and I'll paint it gray. I would like to create a blue strip here. often on these parts you would see text. For the tutorial purposes, I'll just write CG Tuts plus 652187. It's a bit too small, let's set it to 10 maybe, and I'll use Arial as my font and just set it to white. Okay, Control T to transform the selection, Shift rotate it to 90 degrees, and I'll place it here. I can even copy this one and paste it again here, and we'll place it in the middle. And that would actually look very nice. Take a look and you will see what I mean. There's the capacitor body. We'll go to texturing, update PSD network. Give it a few seconds and there you go. There's the text I was talking about, CG Tuts plus, and a bunch of random numbers. And I think that looks very, very nice. Now, the gray line is too thick. I think I would like it to be a bit less thick, so I'll just mark it and move it a bit to the left. And that, dear good folks, wraps up the color section of this texture. All we have left to do is mark all these layers, duplicate those, and merge those. So we'll have one layer containing all the color information. Let's close the color folder, and that wraps up lesson number 8. In the next lessons, we'll build the bump, diffuse, and specular color.